All right. So, everybody's on who's on. Thanks for coming to this keys for training for 100-mile plus gravel races with CTS coach Maddison Russell. He is a pro level coach with CTS who's based out of San Diego, and he focuses on gravel and road cycling. He's a graduate of Indiana University, exercise science major and minor in coaching and psychology. So maybe he can help me figure out my brain. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you've been with CTS since 2017, huh?
Yeah, I think it'll be 8 years this year, so in the spring this year. So it's pretty crazy. It's time has flown by. It seems like just yesterday I was kind of taking my car out to Colorado, not knowing what I was getting into and jumping headfirst in the coaching world. But yeah, it's been a awesome journey with CTS and been very lucky to work with the best in the business for the entire time that I've been with them. The support and the level of expertise that we have at CTS is unmatched, in my opinion. I'm obviously biased, but I've had a chance to learn from the best, so it's been amazing.
And so for those that have registered for this, CTS and Madison are kind enough to put together a 20-week training plan that you can use on your TrainingPeaks account. And February 1st is a perfect time to get that started for those big June races. For all those lucky ducks that got into Unbound and Steamboat. Sounds like there's a new gravel race down in Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak Apex Gravel. Do you know anything
Yep.
about
I'm not too familiar with the event yet. I'm sure some of the guys, the local team to Colorado Springs would be able to speak on the race a little bit better. I mean, they've certainly had a good history of mountain bike racing, in that area. So I think it makes sense to bring some of the gravel scene to the area as well. So yeah, I'm excited to check it out too. I'll have to look into that and see what it's all about.
Nice. All right. So just a couple of housekeeping items. I've gotten a couple questions already. Yes, we're recording this, and yes, we will share this out after the fact. Goal is to send it out on Friday. We'll have links in there for the webinar video, the training plan, how you can get a hold of Madison and the rest of the crew at CTS and get your training dialed up for the season. Um, as far as using the Zoom here, if you want to ask a question through Q&A, that's great. Just know that that's only visible by me, basically. I'm going to let Madison focus on his presentation. And then you can throw questions in the chat. Everybody can see those and respond if they like. And then I'm going to be trying to keep track of both of those things and answer, pull any questions out of there if we need. And we'll save some time at the end for any follow-up Q&A stuff. All right, I'll let you get after it, Madison.
Sweet. So this is keys to training for 100 plus mile gravel races. I think the first thing I'll kind of start with is that um, you can use the information, I'm going to go through in this presentation to apply to gravel races of any distance. So, if you showed up to this webinar and you're like, hey, my gravel race is only 50 miles, that's totally fine, right? Like a lot of this information is going to carry over to how you would approach preparing for any gravel race. I think there's an extra layer within gravel racing as far as the duration is concerned. A lot of these races are really long, right? Unbound 200 miles. Some of this ultra stuff has taken off as well. So that's kind of where our focus is going to be, but you can use this information for gravel racing of any distance. So when we look at preparing for races, a lot of times I'm starting out to in, right? So as coaches, the first place we want to start with an athlete, or suggest an athlete starts is actually looking at the specific demands of their event that they're training for. So in this case, specifically gravel races, long gravel races. So to start looking at duration and intensity, how long is your race? How long is it likely to take you? Right? In addition to that, the intensity. So even if you don't consider yourself a racer or somebody that's maybe going to be at the front of the pack, a lot of these gravel races start really, really hard. It's probably advantageous for you to get in a group early, regardless of your skill and fitness level. And in addition to that, there's a lot of sections on these courses that force intensity, right? So they force you to go hard, something steep and loose, something deep and sandy. You're going to have to put power down in that situation, right? So you want to look at both the duration and the intensity demands of what you're training for. Hydration and nutrition. This is a big one for any race, but when you go into a gravel race, there are a lot of other things you have to consider with this. The ease of transporting the amount of hydration nutrition you need, for example. It's not easy to do. You get into a race that's 6, 7, 8+ hours. So you have to be able to strategize that piece to things, right? So got to look at hydration, nutrition. What are your needs? How are you going to carry the things that you need? What's your aid station strategy going to be? And we'll go into hydration, nutrition a little bit more specifically later in the presentation. Technical skills. This is a huge one. This was a huge one for me coming in from a roadie background, and I know a lot of you guys are probably road cyclists getting into gravel. The skills piece is really important. This could be the difference between hanging with the group for the duration of the race or getting dropped in early single track, being in no man's land. So you want to block out time within your training plan to focus on your skills. So this could be as simple as like 1 day a week of dedicated skills work. But you have to consider this. What is the race you're training for? What do the technical portions of that course and race look like? Tactics and logistics. How do you want to race your race? What sort of experience level, fitness level are you going to be at? How is that going to dictate your approach to the race? A lot of this piece is breaking down the course. So this is something I do with athletes a lot, is like looking at exactly how the course breaks down. Where are the technical sectors? Where are the key climbs? And how are we going to approach the race from a tactical standpoint in order to maximize our finishing time, our speed, power, whatever it is. Logistics, kicking back to like aid station support, feed zone support. This could be like equipment choices too, right? Tire choice is obviously huge. Bike choice. Do I have a pack? Do I have bottles? Do I run a top tube bag? All of these logistics, right? So this is a huge piece with gravel race in particular. It's not as straightforward as, maybe some of the organized road events you've done in the past where there's really well supported aid stations the whole time and it's easy to find them, and you're not out there maybe quite as long. And finally, environmental factors. This is huge. What are the environmental conditions that your race is going to be running? Is the race at altitude, like Steamboat? Right? Is it going to be really hot and humid, like Unbound might be? Or even, what are the conditions of the dirt or the surfaces that you're going to be racing on? Is it going to be muddy? Is it loose? Is it sandy? Is it rocky? Right? So you really want to look at all of these pieces as that really outermost layer of how you're assessing your preparation for one of these long gravel races. So long range planning is the next step in that process. So we know the event demands. We know what we're getting into at this point. So now we go in and we want to really determine that long range plan, that sort of shell, that architecture of our training preparation. But I say you want to find your target and you want to find your goal. So those are two different things, in my opinion. Target is kind of the race that you're aiming for, right? Steamboat, Unbound, Pikes Peak. But the goal is an entirely different piece. So you want to have the target, but you also want to get really specific with yourself about what your goal is. Because if you don't know that, you may get into the race, you may have a good day, but you can still leave feeling disappointed. So you want to come up with some process goals, um, some outcome goals, right? So you want to be able to determine, what are some process goals? What are some day-to-day, week-to-week things that I can do leading into this bigger goal? What are some performance goals? Do I want my FTP to be 15% higher before race day? And then outcome, right? Like how long do I want the race to take me? How fast, what average speed do I want to hold? What place do I want to get? Those are outcome goals. So that's starting spot. Um, Building in supporting events is a big one. So this is actually one of the bigger mistakes I see athletes make is they have one or two like really big A races, and then that's all they do for the whole year, right? So it's like 6 months of training, A race. But what happens when you don't have some of these lower stakes, shorter events built in is that you're missing opportunities to have a better plan. So you'll go into those shorter races, those C races, those B races we call them, with a plan, and you'll leave with a better plan for your A race. So that's really important. That's something that I usually block in maybe 4 to 6 weeks ahead of an A race, as the last event before an A race. That way you have enough time to fill in gaps as far as fitness is concerned, fill in planning, logistics, things like that, your hydration, nutrition. Um, so it's really important to build those in and to learn from those experiences. When you look at like, how long do you want those shorter events to be? Like what percentage of your goal should they be? I'm sort of in the 2/3 to 3/4 range. So if you're training for a 100-mile gravel race, for example, I think it's a great idea to do a gravel race that's roughly 70 miles ahead of that, right? Because then you're going to be able to assess what those needs are, what the demands are likely to be when you get out there on a 100-mile course, right? And it's not going to be as hard to recover from. So, really important to build in supporting events to test your race day strategy. Um, Less specific to more specific, this is just a concept that as you get closer to a goal, everything that you're doing needs to match the demands of that goal more specifically, right? So, for example, your race is completely flat. Well, in the month before preparation for that race, you probably wouldn't want to spend quite as much time climbing hills, right? You might get some good power numbers out of that, but it's not specific to your race. It's not as fast and pedally, maybe as group focused as your race will be. So you just want to make sure that as you get closer and closer to that event, you're planning things that are more specific to what you're going to encounter. So along with this goes addressing those environmental and topographical demands. Like I just mentioned, what's the terrain like? Is it hilly? Is it flat? What type of surfaces are on course? Is there single track? Is it mostly smooth gravel? These are all things that you can build into a long range plan. Everybody, when you talk about long range plan, we're always thinking about it in the context of like interval work or energy system development and things like that, which are all really important. But when I work with an athlete in developing an annual training plan, you call it a long range plan, we also build into that specific microcycles or periods of time where we are addressing these demands, right? So we're focusing on hills or we're focusing on group riding. We're doing heat training. We're going to altitude, right? You're actually building those pieces into your plan alongside all the structured work, all the energy system development, right? So then you have that plan laid out, you're not just reacting along the way, right? Oh, I guess I should go spend some time on single track instead of already having planned out, those weeks or those months where you're going to make a targeted push to spend more time on single track. So it's all about just being intentional with how you're planning things, right? Like setting the intention. This is what I'm going to do, and this is when, and this is how, right? Because that is going to allow you to get the most out of yourself. In the same vein of specificity with this, the skills and off-road work, like I was just talking about, it's really important and it's also really easy to ignore and not do, especially if you're somewhere where you don't have immediate access to dirt, or trails. Maybe you're inside training more often. Then, like I said, you're going to have to get really intentional with this and you're going to have to plan for it. Maybe you go to a training camp where you can spend a lot of time in dirt in a concentrated way. Great opportunity to get better in that case because the skills work, just like with any sort of development to an energy system, to FTP, VO2 max, whatever it is, it's all about concentrating stimulus, right? So you need to spend a lot of time doing something to get better at it and to adapt to it and to test your equipment, right? Test tire choice, things like that. So building the skills and off-road work into that long-range plan, I think is really critical to just that long-term success when it comes to these gravel races. Okay, so this is a fun one, training periodization. How do you actually prepare for one of these 100-mile gravel races? What do you need to consider within your training plan to maximize your fitness for those events? So I've broken down a few different things here. First, using the training phases and then actually going into system development and kind of the key systems that we're looking at developing when it comes to preparation for endurance gravel events. So I work within these 4 training phases. Other coaches might have some different terminology around these phases, some different focuses, but this I think is a good way to lay things out that's clear and it's easy to follow. So I'll start with the transition phase, which I know is actually at the bottom, but I think I'll start with that one because it's kind of the easiest to explain and it's sort of the least critical in regard to the build in. It's more of like a post race type of training phase. So transition phase essentially comes after an event has been completed. So an A race or your final race for the year, we build in a transition phase. This is simply a period of time where the athlete is recovering, taking some time off, maybe doing some different activities, skiing in the winter, cross training, things like that. It's a period where you can deload and de-stress, right? Both mentally and physically. A lot of times people block, this kind of forced rest in at like the end of a year, basically, December holidays or something like that, and then they get going again in January. But you can even sort of do like a micro transition phase after your first peak for the year. Because let's say you have a spring race and a fall race. Well, you're probably working really, really hard all the way through the winter, all the way through the spring for something in May. Stands a reason you could benefit from having a little bit of a break after that. We know that it can take upwards of 10 days to 2 weeks to lose any meaningful training adaptations. And it could be a game changer from like a mental perspective to take that break, right? You kind of need to have some time to let it sink in. So a lot of times I'll use it within the middle of the season as well, if an athlete has 2 peaks. Types of riding within that phase, mostly just recovery endurance, probably keep intensity at a minimum. Foundation phase. So this is kind of your starting spot in your build towards your season or build towards your goal race. Other people would call this maybe base phase, right? That's a common one a lot of us have heard. And so it's going to follow from a lot of the stereotypes that are put in place around like a base phase. So it's a lot of low intensity training for the most part. We're talking zone two, zone one, maybe building into some like sweet spot or zone three work, particularly if you have either multiple foundation phases to fit within your periodization, or if you're crunched for time in terms of the lead into your race, you maybe can't do as many foundation phases. You may have to start getting the engine going a little bit quicker with tempo work as opposed to, only doing sort of easy mileage or zone two work. So it really depends. But sort of the overall theme of the foundation phase is low to moderate intensity because you're building that foundation, you're preparing the body, preparing that aerobic system to handle more workload. That's what you're doing. You're just sort of like firming up that bottom layer, and making sure that you can handle, the harder threshold workouts or VO2 max workouts. Later on in your periodization. So foundation phase, usually we'll say 2 to 3 months of this. Again, it really is highly dependent on what the athlete is training for, what you're training for, and how long you have to train for, and where your current fitness is, right? So you may already have a really good foundation under you, and your race may be coming up quick. This phase you may not spend as much time in. So from there, go into a preparation phase. So this is like the really hard work, the nitty gritty work, we'll call it, where you're in the trenches a little bit with this stuff. So this is a lot of threshold work, a lot of sweet spot work, probably as well. You're preparing for race intensity. So it's everything's sort of building on itself with this four-phase model. So preparations building on foundation in advance of a specialization phase and a racing season. So here, a lot of times with athletes, like I said, I'm doing a lot of FTP work, volumes probably going up a little bit as well if they can handle it. And we're focused on that system development, and I'll get down into the systems here in a second, and so we'll loop back a couple times to referencing the different phases of training. Again, preparation phase 2 to 3 months. I think this phase is worth spending a lot of time in, maybe even more so than the foundation phase if you don't have that many weeks to prepare. If you only have 16 weeks to prepare for an event, I think you're better off spending, 8 weeks within preparation, because developing that functional threshold power, developing fatigue resistance is incredibly important when it comes to being able to withstand the demand of a race that's 100 miles over mixed surface terrain, right? These systems are really key and really critical for developing, for a lot of athletes, and they're usually underdeveloped for a lot of people. That time and intensity maybe hasn't been high enough for long enough. So really building out some longer intervals in here, some longer FTP intervals, longer sweet spot intervals, in anticipation of even higher intensity. Going into specialization phase, this can look a lot of different ways for people. It's dependent on the athlete, depending on how their season has gone, depending on what race they're training for. There are all these sort of caveats to what the specialization phase can look like, but the overall theme is it's specialization, right? So you're specializing the training, you're tailoring it specifically to all those things that I just mentioned. Generally, though, you are going to do a lot more high intensity during this phase because it's usually coming right before your race. So it depends on what type of race you're doing, but this phase you'll see a lot of high intensity VO2 max work. We'll do a lot threshold over-unders, hard over-under workouts, race-specific workouts. Maybe you're even doing anaerobic capacity workouts in this phase. depending on the type of rider you are. So it's the theme is really high intensity here, because you're prepping the body for those race specific efforts. Um, and then you lead into a taper goal event from there, and then back to this transition phase that I just mentioned. Um, so pulling down into system development, this is kind of our next step, and this is one, we could probably do a whole nother presentation on, and you can really get into the weeds with system development. But I want to kind of highlight these four things in relation to those 100-mile gravel races, like why you need each of these things to be successful in those races, and what you need to do to develop them. So zone two, again, this is like a really hot topic right now. I mean, it's always been a hot topic, but I think recently it's been popularized even more. Within a lot of media, there's a lot of buzz around this. Essentially, this zone two work, there are a couple goals you're trying to accomplish with this. And, once you've sort of done enough work to accomplish those goals, you don't have to keep spending so much time here and ignore the higher intensities, right? So all of these systems are important at different times for different reasons. So one of the big things you're doing with zone two work is you're trying to increase mitochondrial density. So what does that do? Well, essentially, it makes the body more efficient at using fat as a fuel source. And that's advantageous, for a lot of reasons, particularly because these long endurance gravel events are going to require a mixture of fuel sources to get you to the finish line. You're going to have to be able to spare some glycogen, right, for some of these harder sectors within these courses. So it's really advantageous to build that. Your body basically creates more capillary density. It becomes more efficient aerobically doing this zone two work, and it becomes better at utilizing fat as a fuel source. So this is a starting spot for a lot of athletes, but it's also something that you want to include within your week to week training as well. It's part of a balanced training plan, in my opinion, to have zone two work throughout every phase that I just ran through: foundations, preparation, specialization. However, you can kind of think about it this way: if you're heavy on the zone two within the foundation phase, and then you're moving on to sort of developing some of these things like FTP and VO2 max, you're almost going into a maintenance mode with that zone two stuff, because you've sort of built that foundation of zone two stimulus, and now you're just sort of maintaining that. Um, One piece to that, though, is obviously building in longer zone two rides within your training plan as you get closer to a really long gravel race, right? So you're going to want to do some of these really long, probably 3 hour, 4 hour, 5 hour plus potentially rides within that specialization phase. So there's an element of specificity within a long gravel race, that speaks to zone two, right? So you're going to have to include this within your training plan. You don't want to spend, like I said, too much time on this indefinitely, because if you don't develop those other systems, FTP, VO2 max, you're gonna be limited in your ability to turn the power up when you need to stay in the group, to make it over the hill, to recover from those early efforts. It's like I said earlier, a lot of these gravel races start really hard. And so you have to be able to put some of this effort down early to be able to stay with the group, establish your position within the group, and then carry better overall speed, result in a faster finishing time. So zone two is kind of like your base of work, very important to work into your training plan. But you also want to spend a good amount of time, on these higher intensities. And I think it's one of those things that you have to assess how much time you have, right? If you're an athlete who only has 6 to 8 hours a week, it simply is not going to be advantageous for you to spend months and months and months of only doing zone two work. right? There's going to be a sort of limit on the return of that time that you put in, because ultimately all of our limiter is time. That's kind of the one thing that you butt up against at some point is you just don't have any more time. So at that point, if your stimulus is volume based, but you can't add any more volume, then you're kind of it's butting heads with itself at that point, right? You're going to have to introduce some intensity. You're going to have to introduce some time and intensity. Um, and when you do that and how often you do it, again, it depends on your baseline level of fitness, what you're training for, and where you are in your periodization. Uh, FTP, this is really important. And I'll speak to a couple components of FTP, not only the number, right? So you have this FTP number, but also your time to exhaustion at that number, because those two things do not always go hand in hand. So we want to try to focus on developing both. So with FTP, there's kind of two things you can focus on. You can focus on going up, or you can focus on going out. And what I mean by that is you can push that absolute number up, right? So you go from 250 to 275 watts at FTP, or you can push it out. So, instead of FTP going from 250 to 275, maybe it goes from 250 to 258. But instead of only being able to put in 30 minutes of work there, continuous work there before exhaustion occurs, maybe you can put in 50 minutes of work there before exhaustion occurs. So those are both two really important components of FTP, and you want to be able to try and maximize both. So you want to try to get that number as high as you can, but you also want to make sure that your time to exhaustion at that number is really wide as well, right? So going into these really long races, it's very advantageous to be able to put in more time at intensity around threshold, because there's going to be a lot of situations where you're maybe forced to that power, or you need to do that power to stay with the group you're in or to hit the climb at your goal target. And so if your time to exhaustion at FTP is too low, you're going to be really limited on the time you can spend there. So those are both key things that you want to develop within a training plan. And going back to the preparation phase, that's why I sort of said there, you want to spend a lot of time here, because it takes time to do both of those things. If you're an early, training, cyclist without a lot of experience, FTP is probably going to balloon out super fast, right? And even your time to exhaustion will go out at the same time. But at some point, those gains aren't going to come as easily. And so you're going to have to spend more time within these zones to continue to gain adaptation to that system, right? So both that absolute number and that time to exhaustion. So within the training plan, you want to be able to focus on both in preparation for these gravel races. One sort of deeper look at how to do that. So when you look at pushing FTP up, where we say the word intensive, right? Intensive FTP, you'd be targeting really the upper end of that threshold range. That's like 95 to 100% of FTP, but even higher, right? So like 100 to 105% of FTP, something that's really going to push lactate accumulation up quickly. You're doing slightly shorter efforts, right? Usually efforts between 6 to 10 minutes, with a 2-to-1 work to rest ratio. That's going to really target that and those intensive properties of FTP. When it comes to the extensive piece, so building things out, building your time to exhaustion out, you have to extend interval duration, and you have to put in more time there. So this is like your 4 by 15 minutes. This is your 3 by 20 minutes. Getting full hour of time and intensity in zone 4, or near FTP, and doing that in repeated bouts during the week. And again, when you look at into how to tailor all those workouts in more specifically, it just really depends on where you are in your progression. You'll have to assess what you can handle from a time and intensity standpoint. VO2 max, Now, this is one where it's easy to discount VO2 max. Maybe not for the reason you think. Everyone has heard VO2 max. It's a great predictor of performance in some sense. Um, it's a number that we get fixated on. Um, but for a lot of these like really long gravel races, I see a lot of athletes make the mistake of not doing any VO2 max work because the assumption is, well, it's a really long race. I'm gonna have to keep my power controlled. I'm just trying to finish, right? I'm not trying to race. I'm not trying to win. So I don't need this high intensity. Um, I think that's a mistake for most people. And the reason being that is if that ceiling, if that maximal aerobic ceiling is too low for too long, your development at FTP gets stunted, right? At some point, you're butting up against that ceiling and you're not going anywhere, right? So I think when it comes to development of threshold, which for a lot of people may be a more critical metric when it comes to determining performance in these long gravel races, actually pushing VO2 max up can help you do that. In addition to that, though, like we've talked about before, there's lots of periods within these gravel races where you may be doing intensity that you don't want to do or you didn't anticipate, right? You might have more efforts early in that race than you were expecting to have. So being able to have more bullets in the chamber is really, really helpful when it comes to recovering from those early efforts you didn't anticipate and be able to still finish these races with a little bit more left in the tank. So VO2 max work, it's really hard, it's really intense, but I wouldn't wait until right before the race to touch any of this. I would try to do this within a specialization phase or preparation phase, but let's say 8 weeks out, right? Then you get your dose of high intensity and you shift into workouts that are maybe more specific even to what you're doing. So again, you have to kind of assess for yourself where it makes sense to do this based on your current progression and goal. But I do think it is critical for even endurance cyclists to incorporate at least one build of VO2 max work in preparation for a long gravel race. Finally, fatigue resistance. So this is something that maybe some of you guys have heard of, maybe not. It's sort of a new-ish term that's getting thrown around, been around for a bit, but like we've sort of put more of a name on it. You could call it durability too. Some people refer to it as durability. Essentially, this piece is just your ability to put out power closer to your maximal power for any sort of power duration number. Let's say it's 20-minute power. So it's being able to put out a higher percentage of your maximal 20-minute power after prolonged endurance exercise. And that's a lot of times measured through kilojoule expenditure, right? So it's after 1,500 kilojoules or 2,000 kilojoules. What's the drop off in that power curve, right? This is a really key metric. It's something a lot of pro cyclists spend a lot of time focusing on. I think it's really important to develop, but I do think that you want to focus on these other systems first and make sure that all the low-hanging fruit in this area is developed really well first. Because if you don't do that, then you're sort of missing out on some potential. Your fatigue resistance is good, but only at 70% of what you're capable of. So ultimately, you're not sort of meeting that full potential if you do too much of this work without raising the ceiling, without raising FTP. It's a complement to that type of development, right? And this type of work is really hard. It's basically to failure. You talk about time to exhaustion. This work is basically putting in a ton of time, pushing higher power, to develop basically like huge amounts of kilojoule expenditure and then doing efforts after that. Again, wouldn't do this right before a race, but probably 8 weeks before, 12 weeks before is a good time to build in blocks of fatigue resistance training. And so this can look a lot of different ways. Maybe it's 4 blocks of 20 minutes at a sweet spot with, max 2-minute effort at the end of each 20-minute block. Or it's just a full hour and a half or 2 hours where you're just smashing on the pedals, trying to put as many kilojoules in as you can, right? So those would be examples of this type of training. And it's essentially to develop the ability to put in a ton of time at intensity and still come back strong at the end of a race. So obviously, big key for a lot of these longer gravel races. But don't forget, I really would focus on those first three I talked about first. And if you're a more advanced or experienced rider, potentially looping in some fatigue resistance work could be a really good marginal gain for you at that point. Hydration and nutrition planning. So this is a huge piece of being successful within a long gravel race. You can be as fit as you want to be, but if you don't eat enough, you're not going to be able to take advantage of that fitness, especially deep in a race. Um, a lot of these days we're seeing a lot of cyclists pushing really high levels of carbohydrate in. Um, I think, in terms of whether or not it's necessary to do, 120, 150 grams of carb an hour, that's something that you'll have to assess and work up to. But whenever it comes to, this hydration nutrition planning, you want to focus on the experimentation and tracking piece first. So you have to play around with a lot of different things. You have to build up. So right now you may only eat, half a bar an hour on a ride. Well, your goal may be to get to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, but you're going to have to work up to that and you're going to have to experiment with how much you're doing and when. So this is something that I express to athletes. You have to start very early in training, 20 weeks before your goal event, 16 weeks before your goal event. You have to start tracking how much you're doing and figuring out what your needs are. Um, Requirements for fueling, like I kind of alluded to, it's a little bit of a moving target. I would say if the ride or event is somewhere in the like 2 hour range or less, you can get by with roughly 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. If you're looking at these 100-mile races that again may take 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, something like that, you're going to need somewhere between 90 and 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour to maximize your performance. So I think for a lot of my athletes, the goal is just to get to 90 or 100 grams per hour, which is a pretty high amount of carbohydrate intake. You have to assess if you can tolerate and put in more, but usually just getting to that 90 to 100 grams is our target. And that's something that we experiment with and track and change over time. And we do it gradually, right? If 1 week we're pushing 20 grams of carb per hour, we're not going from 20 to 90, we're going from 20 to 40 to 60, and so on and so forth. Your body can handle those small jumps, but if you try to push too much too fast, you're just going to get GI distress, right? So this goes back to gut training. The gut is trainable just like any other system, but you're going to need to give it time to do so. So a lot of times, I say give athletes probably 6 to 8 weeks of significant gut training where you're really trying to push the limit of what you can put in. And long rides are great opportunities for this. They're actually key opportunities for this. And then really any of your rides, longer endurance rides or intensity-based rides. Hydration is a really variable thing between athletes. Sodium needs change drastically between athletes. Fluid needs change drastically between athletes. You'll have to assess like race conditions to determine your needs to a degree. But again, with all this stuff, experimentation and tracking. So weigh yourself before and after a ride. How much fluid do you put in? Look at the difference and see if you need more, right? There's a lot of sweat tests out there now, sodium concentration tests, where you can determine how many milligrams of sodium you're losing per liter of sweat per hour. Definitely a great thing to have done if you have that available to you. If not, then you just have to go back to the experimentation piece, right? Try, 500 milligrams of sodium in liter bottle, try 750, try 1,000, see how you feel after those rides, see what changes as far as your RPE is concerned. Um, I had a question before kind of in regard to like pre-event hydration. Um, this is something that's especially necessary in like hot conditions, in terms of maybe preloading with sodium, with electrolyte drinks. Um, the protocol I like is, having maybe like a 500 milliliter bottle the night before, 500 milliliters the morning of, something along those lines, with a typical amount of sodium that you would put in per bottle per hour. So you're just adding a little bit on top, in those hot conditions. And your needs are going to change in those hot conditions. So your needs may double. And that's the case for a lot of athletes, is that maybe 20 ounces an hour in typical conditions may go up to 40. So these are all things that you have to consider and prepare for within training. Weigh yourself, in similar conditions that you'd experience in the race, as far as temperature, and you'll be able to determine that loss easier. And then just tailoring the fueling strategy to the demands, right? Um, should you have a pack? Should you have bottles? Should you utilize aid station, top tube bag? All these types of things, right? But the key is just having the plan and doing it in training leading up to the event. So every big gravel ride you do, every mini camp you do, a lot of your interval workouts, use the same things that you're planning on using in the race, and then you can really figure out what works and what doesn't. TrainingPeaks Virtual, wanted to touch on this just a little bit, um, in the sense of like a virtual approach to training for a gravel race, because a lot of us don't maybe have access to a good place to ride outside. The weather may be bad for half of your training plan leading into Unbound. You may not be able to get outdoors and do a lot of these workouts. And so that's where having a platform like this is extremely helpful, right? Because you have all your workouts getting pulled into this. It's right in front of you, and it really streamlines and makes the training process more efficient, right? You don't have to deal with stoplights, you don't have to deal with stop signs. This is going to be a system that does allow you to do an incredibly effective and efficient training session, without having to leave your house, right? So I think that's the big benefit in my mind in terms of like how to incorporate this within a training plan, looking at these long races. Um, I would, again, and less specific to more specific. So okay, your race is outside on gravel, but weather's not as good in the winter. I think it makes sense to build up with your structured work, within a virtual platform inside during those winter months. And as things get nicer out, warmer out, you take that fitness that you've developed, using this really efficient approach, and you move on to, outdoor riding, endurance riding. You actually get out there on the dirt. Um, I want to kick it to Josh too for a second if he wants to mention anything about this. Feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, just a reminder that it's included with Training Peaks Premium. So you don't have to have a subscription for that. It's free for basic users right now until March, um, and then yeah, I mean, I I've been using it just for those structured workouts where you're just trying to work on a specific system. So
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, okay, so questions. I think there's some stuff in the Q&A chat, right? We got 10 minutes, so maybe let's
yeah.
try to run through some of these.
Yeah, there's been a couple of questions on phase duration,
Hmm.
especially on the specialized phase. If you have any thoughts on like how long that should be?
Yeah, yeah, the specialization phase
Yeah.
specifically. Yeah. Yeah, I would say 8 weeks is a good amount of time to spend there. Um, I think you can go longer, but because we talk about the specialization phase, in regard to being really high intensity work, you don't want to push it out too long, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, something like that, because you're going to risk burnout and you're going to lose some of those gains. So I think 8 weeks is kind of the sweet spot for a phase like that.
There's a couple of questions here too, we're talking mostly about these 100 milers, but let's take it up to 200. What do you think some of the
Mm.
differences would be for those ultra long ride races?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think a lot of the similar principles apply, as far as like the systems that you would want to develop. But I think you just get into more specific demands. You go up to 200 miles, so you double, you're talking about a 12, 15 plus hour day versus something that's 5, 6, 7. Um, you're going to shift to doing more work that's specific to the intensity of that ride. So intensity is probably going to be a lot lower. Volume is going to probably be a lot higher. So your training plan is probably going to fall from that too. So you're probably going to spend a lot more time doing even longer rides, even more zone two work, even more zone three work, sweet spot work, fatigue resistance work, because that event is so much longer. So you'd probably, as that event shifts out in time and reduces its intensity, same thing happens in your training plan, shifts out in time and reduces in intensity would be the most ideal approach.
Um, there's one here kind of sticking with that specialized phase thing. You taper after and before the event. Like, what do you usually prescribe as a taper?
Yeah, good question. Um, I would say 10 to 14 days is a really good duration for most people, especially if your volume isn't quite as high, right? Like somebody that's training, within like the 8 to 10 hour range. Um, you don't want to reduce too much for too long. I'd usually do something within a 10 to 14 day period. So that's like a step down. The week before race is like 75% of the previous week's volume, and then you're down to like 30 to 50 the week of the race. You cut time and intensity, but still keep some intensity within the schedule. So that's I think the sweet spot I've found for a lot of athletes is that 10 to 14 day period.
Okay. There's a few questions about strength training.
Mhm.
Are you incorporating that much? And if so, like how many times a week throughout the duration of the training plan?
Yeah. Yeah, so this one, again, it depends, right? I think this really depends on a lot of things, the athlete's experience level with strength training. What do they have available to them in terms of equipment? Are they going to work with someone in person? Are they going to be on their own? Um, Long story short, I think it's important for every athlete to do some form of this work. Now, what exactly that looks like depends on all those things I just mentioned. It could be as simple as 20 minutes 3 times a week. It could be an hour twice a week. I think usually for most of the people I'm working with that are doing strength training, we're looking at probably 2 times a week, within the season. It's being blocked after intense bike sessions, so not before. A lot of times on the same day, if we can get away with it, because you're concentrating workload as opposed to like spilling over into recovery days. Um, and it's usually very basic movement, core work. You're looking at like hinge, squat type work, a lot of body weight, a lot of bands. So we may not even touch heavy weights, but it'll be sort of like I call it like durability training, like training your body for the long haul. When it comes to like dealing with the physical demands of doing a gravel race over a mixed surface.
Um, there was a few questions here. When we're talking about gravel races, it's rough,
Mhm.
nasty terrain sometimes. How do you manage your nutrition and hydration in those kind of? worlds.
Yeah, yeah. It's not easy, I will say, first off. But the first thing you got to do is like strategize in training. So, like, put together a plan around how you're going to do it in training and see if it works. Um, there are a few kind of tips I can give you guys. One big one, and this it's going to seem small, but I promise it's big, is like actually just opening your like nutrition products before you go out for a ride or before you go out for a race. That way you're not fumbling with a bag of Cliff Blocks as you're like trying to go over rough gravel, or you're not trying to like open a bar while the group is splitting and you're trying to close a gap. You open the package before you get into the race so it's easy to get in. It's all about creating efficiencies, putting gels in a flask so you don't have to carry as many packages. Using I really like top tube bags and frame bags for these types of things. So packing all your nutrition in bags on the bike. They're easy to access. You have all your stuff with you and it won't, bounce out of your pockets or whatever. Uh, Hydration, I'm a big fan of hydration pack. I think for a 100-mile gravel race or anything, in this duration plus, it's super necessary, right? Like even if you have people helping you at aid stations, like what happens if you eject a bottle and you're 20 miles away from the aid station? If you don't have any hydration, your performance is going to suffer. So it gives you options. So I think having a pack is a great thing to have during these races. Use it in training. You're just trying to create these efficiencies that make it easier to access your nutrition hydration in those conditions. But practice makes perfect with that stuff.
Right. Let's see. Here's a here's a little more technical question. Well, and then
Okay.
one or just a couple more. Um, what do you think that there's a difference in the pedal cadence for gravel versus road?
Yeah, I think there can be for sure. I think if anything, my answer to that question is that I think it changes more frequently and the range of cadences is wider. So there's a wider range of cadences that you will have to access and potentially be efficient at within a gravel race as opposed to a road race where things are going to be more consistent. Your cadence may drop a little bit on a climb in a road race, but in a gravel race, it's going to change a lot more. And so that's a great thing to try to implement within your training plan. So doing high cadence drills, doing low cadence drills, but even more than that, just training on the same surfaces and same types of terrain that you're going to be racing on your endurance rides, on your workouts, things like that, making as one-to-one as you can is going to help your body adapt to those cadence changes better.
Right. Excuse me. Let's just finish up with a couple questions around training plans. So
Cool.
CTS is kindly handing off this 20-week plan. Um, a couple people have asked, like, how do you manage that training plan, without a coach? Do you have any like tips on how to kind of like say you miss a workout or something comes
Yeah.
up?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that can be a tricky one. One of the most important things to do, and this is built into the training plan, is frequent assessment. Because if you don't know where you're at, then what you're doing isn't going to be as effective. So I would definitely commit to field testing, every 4 to 6 weeks, like early in this plan, and making sure you know where your zones are, right? Where your ranges are. That's going to be one of the most important things to have determined. Even if your training plan is a little up and down and you miss stuff, you always want to know where you're at, right? So that would be the big one. Um, Outside of that, I think it's one of those things where you need to assess like where you are in your periodization and is it worth making up the workout or not. I think in most situations, what I suggest to athletes is that if you don't have an easy way to make the workout up, just move on, right? One day is not necessarily going to shift the entire landscape of your fitness. So don't get too hung up on like one workout. Just if you miss something, move on to the next one and just continue with the plan. Or if you have enough time within the week to fit the other workout in, but give yourself appropriate rest in between sessions, then do so. So yeah, those would be the two big ones for
Hmm.
sure.
All right. Well, I just want to say thanks for taking the time to present this, and thanks to everyone who joined us. Be sure to check out trainingpeaks.com and trainrate.com. Sign up for newsletters so you can get info and updates on how to train for your best season. And then look for an follow-up email from us all with links to that training plan and how to get in touch with CTS to get going.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks, Josh.
All right, take care, man.
Have a good one.